Okay, lecture number 8. We're continuing on with cultural competence. The last thing we talked about right before this one was norms versus stereotype. Let's just add a word about cultural humor because a lot of us get in trouble because we may share humor at work that we think is funny, and maybe it is funny to us. It may not be funny to everyone. Culturally based humor tends to be a way that, without realizing it and without intending to, we insult other people in ways that we don't even understand. So, traditional humor is you kind of make fun of the different. Um, there's also culturally appropriate humor, and that's making fun of your own culture. This does not always translate well into other languages. One example of this would be raft guide humor. That's a culture that's near and dear to my heart. And the joke that raft guides think is funny is what's the difference between a rafting story and a fairy tale? Well, a fairy tale starts with once upon a time, a long time ago, and a raft story starts with no shit, there I was, right in the top of a class five. So that doesn't really translate very well to people who aren't rafters. So if you didn't laugh at that joke, that's my excuse. Anyway, it's really important when it comes to cultural humor to not share jokes and ideas that make fun of another culture without having what I'd call cultural license. What is cultural license? Cultural license means that if even if you're from culture A but you love culture B, you know the language of culture B, you know you hang out, you've maybe married into, you have enough experience with culture B that you are seen as one of them, then go ahead and tell that joke, but only to culture B people. It's You need enough credentials to be able to, and I'm not saying we should walk out and tell derogatory jokes about anyone, but what I mean is if you're going to make cultural observations, make them about your own culture or one that you identify with closely enough that you have cultural license over that. Okay, so what we're talking about now is cultural competence. This is a process, not a goal. Cultural competence really means understanding, well, it's three things, especially as it relates to how we communicate with people at our work. The first is an understanding of the nature and the impact of one's own culture. Now, I'm a middle aged white male. I need to know what that means. I need to know how that impacts others. I need to know what my norms and rules are because I can't learn other people's norms if I don't even know my own norms. And the funny thing is, most white folks, if you ask them, hey, tell me 6 rules about your culture, they'll be like, because it's really hard to understand the norms of something that you live inside of. It's like asking a fish, what's the water temperature? They're like, I don't know. I'm in it. So understand your own culture impact. One. Two, the second path towards cultural competence is understanding of the norms and the realities of other cultures. And that means having conversations and reading the books and seeing the movies and having conversations about that, really diving into and deeply understanding and appreciating other cultures. How many cultures are there in our county, in our state, in the world? Countless. So this is essentially a never ending task. But when a person starts to try and notice their own culture, and that same person starts noticing norms of other cultures, you're on the path towards competence. The third thing is in cultural competence is the ability to change or be conscious about your own ABCs, your attitudes, your behaviors, and the way that you communicate. Which means if I know the impact of my culture and I know the norms of your culture, I can act and I can behave and I can communicate in a way that's a little bit differently so that you and I can meet in the middle. Instead of me always expecting for you to come over to my culture, I can go over to your culture or we can meet somewhere in the middle. And that's what I'm really talking about is cultural competence. You may have already done this. Let's say that you are a person who grew up Asian, and your family is Asian, you're strongly Vietnamese culture, but you grew up in Sacramento and you went to junior high and high school and you speak English and you've started to assimilate and understand all of the cultural norms of your friends who aren't Vietnamese. That is going towards cultural competence. You know deeply what it means to be a Vietnamese, but you also understand a little bit more of white culture and you understand a little bit more of El Salvadorian culture if you were exposed to that. That's what I'm talking about when I use the term cultural competence. Again, it's an understanding of your culture and impact, an understanding of other cultures, and the ability to use that consciousness to change our ABCs, our attitudes and our behaviors and our communications. Again, cultural competence is a process, not a goal, which means if this is something you decide to do, it's work and it's a lifelong process. Nobody is culturally competent, but many people strive in that direction. Cultural norms, when I talk about the word cultural norms, um, they're very generalized. I mean, when I make an observation about a culture, it's painting in very broad strokes because everyone's an individual. Everyone sees their own culture in a different way. So anytime we make cultural observations, we're talking not just painting in draw strokes, we're talking about a paint roller that's 24 inches wide because sometimes you need, you know how they say never label? Well, sometimes we're going to label. Sometimes we have to make generalized observations about a culture. These are tools that help us understand perspectives, but they're never going to see us, they're never going to give us the ability to see everyone as individuals. So I'll talk about norms of white culture, black culture, Latino culture, LGBT culture, and deaf culture, just so you get an idea of what norms are like. Okay, here's a norm of white culture. Confrontation tends to be uncomfortable. Instead of confronting someone, I'm going to tend to be very indirect and I'm going to circle around my point and then maybe finally come to it because being direct would be considered rude. Another norm of white culture is that meals are no longer a shared communal affair. Meals are for food. For instance, an American would think nothing about eating a hamburger or a bagel while walking down the street, where if you did that in Paris, French people are like, dude, food's important. Sit down, enjoy your food, taste your food, talk with others while you're eating food. Pair bonding in white culture is a very ordered process. What I mean by paired bonding, I mean when we hook up with someone who we want to be with. In America, we meet, we date, we hook up, we cohabitate, and we marry, and then we might divorce. And it kind of happens in that order. It's a very ordered process. And finally, one of the weird cultures of white culture is that we tend to be really uncomfortable with the word white. Like it's a kind of a word. You know, we tend to say words like Caucasian or something like that, or American. It's a weird thing. We're uncomfortable with the word white, some of us. And you know what? There's about 10 million other norms of white culture, but you don't need to hear them all. Some of the norms of black culture: family. Family is extended to those people who are not necessarily blood related. You may have an auntie, but that aunt is not necessarily your mother's sister. It's an important maternal influence in your life. It is really considered friendly to greet one another on the street, even if you're strangers. A simple, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? Two people in black culture just passing in the night without acknowledging each other is unusual and not considered friendly. Trust of white people is usually something that's built up over time rather than given immediately. Trust is a process rather than an immediate thing. Latino culture, some norms of Latino culture: family is the most important institution. Family is everything. Nepotism in hiring is okay. Why? It's family. It's about family. Another norm of Mexican culture would be if you're invited to a quinceañera, which is a young woman's 15th birthday, kind of a coming out birthday party. It is a huge honor to be invited. And it's not like an invite to your white kid's 5th birthday. It is a big deal, and it's a marvelous party. Folks from Mexico, one of their cultural norms is they tend to avoid saying no. They may say, sure, maybe, we'll see, where they actually mean no. So there can be a lot of misunderstanding because white culture tends to be a little bit more direct with the yeses and the nos. And finally, talk about soccer. If you can have a conversation, you don't know what to talk about soccer, you'll be good. Okay, norms of LGBT culture. Great culture. Being out where you are open about being gay is seen as a validation of the culture, and not being out can be seen as a rejection of the culture. Coming out to a person is a show of trust. It's a very specific and very deliberate show of trust. If I come out to you, that means that I trust you and that I assume that you will accept me for who I am. Collectivism and individualism. Collectivism is when a group acts in the group interest, and individualism is where people act in their own interest over the group's interest. And LGBT culture tends to be much more collectivist in its outlook, especially over items of safety and economics. Okay, norms of deaf culture. Being direct is valued. In deaf world, nothing gives a person more respect than being open and honest with them and not beat around the bush, because beating around the bush is a really bad way to communicate. Another rule is if you can see something about another person, you can and should talk about it. Anything that's in the open should be discussed. If another rule is if person A has a problem with person B, we both go to person C, our mutual trusted friend, to help us get back together. We enlist other people to help us with our relationships. And a fourth norm of deaf culture is that American Sign Language is the single most important value of the culture. The language runs deep in the roots, and it's a very, very important thing. There are some movies with cultural themes. Zombieland represents America after the zombie apocalypse, and all the rules are thrown out. Slumdog Millionaire represents the culture of India and how there are classes and how those classes are very difficult to breach. The movie 40-Year-Old Virgin talks about the oddity that a 40-year-old man would be a virgin and all of the many jokes that can be made about that. The movie Avatar is a good example of where there's an established culture and an outside dominant culture comes in and forces its will on that culture. If you start looking at movie titles, you'll find that there are a lot of influences that are culturally based. Okay, you got homework number 20. Homework number 20 is on page 83, and it's writing a little bit about culture awareness. It's going to ask you 4 questions to write about. On page 83, what's your own cultural identity? Number 2, what are 5 rules of behavior or communication that you can observe about your culture? Number 3, look back on someone who was culturally different from you, and what were some rules that you see that they followed that were different from your rules? And finally, have you ever had a conflict with someone that now when you look back on it, you realize, this was probably a problem in culture and not a conflict in personality, because we can easily misunderstand cultural conflict for personal conflict. So do that, write it up, and send it to me through an email. Thanks very much.